This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Tonight, we will hear from award-winning journalist and political commentator Sean Kelly as he discusses his latest quarterly essay, The Good Fight, What Does Labor Stand For? Sean will be in conversation with Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. So Sean, welcome and thank you for visiting us at the Hawke Centre. It's lovely to have you here. And Misha, thank you for coming back. We must be doing something right. It's really lovely to have you here at the Hawke Centre again. Sean Kelly is an award-winning journalist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and is a regular contributor to The Monthly. He is the author of The Game, a portrait of Scott Morrison, offering many powerful and revealing insights into Morrison's career, as well as being a former political advisor to Labor Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And Sean, I think you deserve a medal for all of that. Hard work. Tonight, Sean will be in conversation with Misha Ketchell, editor and executive director of The Conversation Australia and New Zealand. So please join me in welcoming Sean and Misha to the stage. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm especially looking forward to having this conversation with Sean because I think that this book is written, The Good Fight, is a fantastic essay. Can I just see, has anybody in the room had a chance to read it yet? Can anybody put up their hand if you had a chance to read it? Okay, excellent. It's a really interesting choice of project, and maybe I might actually start there because basically we've got the Albanese government, which had a thumping political victory this year, is now firmly in its second term, at a time when many people would say that it has been stable, successful, managed largely to avoid major controversy. Many people on the Labor side of politics would say that this is a great moment of success for Labor and success for sort of the progressive side of politics. And Sean has chosen, interestingly, this moment to write a book asking the question, really, what does this government stand for? And also, perhaps an even harder question, like, is it any good? Like, what is it actually going to do? What is it going to achieve? It seems to me a rather brave thing to do, particularly when you yourself have spent many years working inside governments, inside politics, and you know how hard it is and how perhaps personally people take the criticism. I actually thought of you, Sean, because many years ago I used to work on a TV program called Media Watch. And people used to say to me, what was that like? And I used to say, well, that job really is making enemies of your former friends. And I sort of thought, to some extent, maybe, Sean, with this book, you're risking something similar because you still know many people in the Labor movement, you still know many people in the government, you work with them, they're riding high, they'd be very confident. To some extent, you'd be pricking the balloon of this confidence. So why did you feel the need to ask this question, the question of what does the Albanese government stand for?
Well, I guess the answer is it came from a slightly different direction to start with. It came partly from that direction, it came partly from another direction. The other direction was that I was driving, those of you who have read the essay will have read this, but I was driving one day to pick up my son from childcare and I called my grandfather's wife, and she's a woman of great political foresight. She said that Kevin Rudd would be torn down by his own side long before anyone was imagining anything like that, and lo and behold, it came to occur, and she's had several Cassandra-like predictions that have come true. Anyway, that's actually irrelevant. She asked me what I believed, and I didn't have an answer. I didn't have a very good, well-thought out answer. And that started me down a rabbit hole of thinking, well, what is belief? Is it something that I can articulate, a set of carefully formulated philosophical principles, or is it a set of policies I believe in, or is it something quite different? Is it a feeling inside? Is it the way I respond when somebody else says something? And I think that is a big part of it for me. If somebody says something that outrages me, it makes me feel like there's an injustice being done. That's what gets me going. And I think, well, that's where my belief resides. But I think that's quite a complex question, actually. And one of the things I found in writing this essay is as I've asked people what they believe, everybody thinks I believe something. Most people I've spoken to have trouble articulating exactly what that is. And I don't think that means they're lying when they say they believe something. I just think it means it's a question with a nuanced answer. And then there was this other thing, and it's been nagging at me because I write a weekly column about politics, and I've been watching this government very closely for 3.5 years. And in some respects, they're a good government. They're certainly, I think, a competent government. I think Anthony Albanese clearly believes in old school Labor things. His priorities so far, wages, workers, Medicare, they are old traditional Labor pursuits. And I've worked with Anthony Albanese, and I have no doubt that he believes things quite sincerely and feels them as well. And also, writing about this government every week, looking at this government, there was something that still puzzled me about them. And as I began to try to figure out what that was, I realised the best word for it was belief. What does this government believe? And that knits up with the other question of where belief resides, because there's a philosopher, there's an American philosopher called Daniel Dennett, who I discovered once I started to go down this rabbit hole of what is belief. And he says, well, belief isn't a feeling inside. Actually, it's something that you can discern from external actions. It is to be found in a pattern of behaviour. So that means if you say somebody believes something, then you can use that to predict what they will do next. So we don't really believe something unless we act in a way that is in accord with that belief. And I think as I was puzzling over these things, I realised that is part of the gap for me with this government. They are heading in certain directions, they do certain things, but they often pull up short. They don't go all the way towards the best possible answer. They often, quite deliberately, I think, avoid going far enough that it will actually upset anybody. And I think that for me, raises the question of belief. It says, well, can you actually discern what they believe from their external actions? If we were just operating without any knowledge of, without any sense of who Anthony Albanese is or any sense of his history, if we were just looking at the actions of the government, what would we decide that they believe? And, to your question of why write this and risk making enemies of my old friends, I think that's an important question. I think it's an urgent question. And, sometimes I find this difficult, but my role is different from what it used to be. And I have, this is obviously a bit grandiose of me, but, it has occurred to me writing this that a thing that has happened to Anthony Albanese in his career, and a reason that he acts differently from the way he acted once upon a time, is his role has changed. He's Prime Minister. He used to be, a left-wing firebrand in the left wing of the centre-left party, and his role has changed. And similarly, I was a political staffer once, and now I try to get to grips with politics, and that means, I think fundamentally, that means trying to tell the truth.
It seems to me that taking that position of saying that perhaps there isn't enough idealism in the way that this government is going about pursuing its goals, or it's not being clear enough about its beliefs, does leave you vulnerable, though, because the political consensus, when you're in the process of doing the work, it is managerial. It is about dealing with threats and risks, and political management is the number one priority. You're in this position of luxury in that you're now outside of that, but also by writing a book like this, you also set yourself up where people could say, well, Sean's being hopelessly idealistic. Idealism is very unfashionable in parts of Canberra, I would say. And I think also you say actually in the essay itself that to some extent, these questions about what the ideals are and what they should be aren't actually being debated enough within the party, that actual discussion isn't happening. To some extent, you're trying to kickstart it. Maybe you can talk a bit about that, because I think that there is a sense that you believe that a healthy political party, in addition to its sort of day-to-day management, will actually have a robust discussion about the ideas and beliefs and ideals.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that I'm quite torn, actually. It's not that I just think the party should be idealistic. I know that's not exactly what you said.
Yep.
I remain torn on this question. I remain torn on the precise balance of idealism and pragmatism. And for me, very much the essay, writing the essay, came from a place of struggle. Struggling to find what I thought about the government. And, you know, there's that, it's almost cliche now, but to say an essay, the word essay means attempt, and that is what an essay should be. And it was an attempt for me to try to figure these things out rather than just to lay out an argument which I'd already decided on beforehand. And I think if you read the essay, you can feel that in the writing. I'm coming to these conclusions as I write. I think there are some really interesting things when you look at that balance between idealism and pragmatism, because I think three things have happened to the Labor Party over the last 50 or 60 years now. Once upon a time, the party would have did describe itself, in fact it does still describe itself this way in its constitution, as a socialist party. Now, it didn't mean Soviet-style socialism, it meant broad equality. But having an ideal meant that there was something that the party was heading towards. And the beauty of having an endpoint, again, not Soviet socialism, but some kind of utopian, if you like, utopian society of equality, more equality than we have now, means that you can always be measured against that. It's an accountability mechanism. You can say, did the decisions and actions we took this week bring us closer to our ideal? And if they did, then great, and if they didn't, well, you can try harder. When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Labor Party and centre-left parties across the world, this is an international problem, lost that end point because it suddenly became taboo to talk about socialism. And maybe that's fine. The point is not that we need to return to parties that want socialism as an outcome, but they did lose something there. They lost that end point because that talk of socialism, in effect, was a proxy for idealism in the Labor Party, which was always struggling between idealism and pragmatism. Always, always, always. And then a second thing happened, and it happened around the same time, interestingly, I think, which is that the Greens came along, and the Greens became quite an important political party in the Australian landscape. And that meant that the idealism that had once been part of the battle within the Labor Party, the left wing battling for idealism and the right wing battling for pragmatism and winning elections, it meant that sense of policy purity kind of migrated outside the party, and the Greens became the symbolic representation of that. And that meant a couple of things. It meant that debate quietened down within the Labor Party because part of that noisy left had vanished from within the party, and it meant that the party itself began to define itself against that policy purity. So it began to define itself more as a pragmatic party. And you can see this in the way Anthony Albanese talks. He talks about Labor being a party of progress, whereas the Greens are a party of protest. And that's a totally legitimate argument to make, but I think it does speak to that emphasis on pragmatism within the party. And then a third thing happened, and this is very recent, which is that a Prime Minister from the left wing of the party became Prime Minister, and then another thing happened at the last election, which is that the party's caucus is now dominated by the left faction. And I think that raises a really difficult question, which is if the left have always been the voice of idealism and the restraint on the pure pursuit of power within the party, what happens when the left become the powerful ones? Who is restraining them? Who is pulling them back in the other direction towards idealism? Yeah. And I think all up that means you have a more pragmatic party, and it also does mean, you can see this, that you have an incredibly quiet caucus. So there's talk, there is talk of a unified caucus, and Anthony Albanese says this as a really positive thing, that the caucus is more unified than it ever has been, and you can understand that a Prime Minister wants that, that a Prime Minister would feel like that is a great thing, but what it also means is they're quiet and you don't have debates. And the thing about people in power, whether, of any political persuasion, is they will always tend more towards compromise in the pursuit of power. It's just, it's a magnetic force in politics, long acknowledged, and you need some people pulling the other way. And at the moment in the Labor caucus, there just doesn't seem to be a lot of dissent. There was a report a couple of weeks ago in the ABC saying a bunch of Labor MPs are really dissatisfied with the party's stance on gambling reform. They really want more action on banning online ads, but they won't say so publicly. Okay, fine, maintaining the appearance of unity, and they won't say so in caucus. So how do you exert pressure in that situation?
Yeah. So maybe let's go back, because it's some interesting material in the essay about Labor's history and the way that perhaps its history drives it towards this idea of pragmatism. You talk about this idea of Labor wanting to prove it's a legitimate party of government, and the fact that in many ways it hasn't been seen, both in Australia and elsewhere, as a legitimate party of government. You could go back to the dismissal, for example, there's scars from that. That's driven it. But you also talk about the ways in which Labor perhaps has overlearnt the lessons of certain policy failures, or where ideas have been rejected. So can you maybe just talk a bit about the forces that are driving this sort of momentum towards a certain type of managerial pragmatism?
I mean, there are so many forces to a pretty large extent. That's what the essay is about. But to single out this question of illegitimacy, there has been this sense in Labor from the very beginnings, and it's, again, this is actually an international thing. It was there in Britain at least as well, and you can understand this. You suddenly had Labor parliamentarians who, in Australia, they were shearers, they were workers, and they were standing in Parliament alongside men of very good standing, men with money, men who were used to holding power. And so there was a sense that the Labor parliamentarians had to prove themselves. They had to prove themselves worthy of those positions. And so they felt that sense of needing to prove themselves, and there were large portions of society that always felt they were illegitimate. And that absolutely continued. Neville Wran, long-serving New South Wales Premier, wrote a foreword to a Labor history 40 years ago, which, 40 years sounds a long time ago, but we're talking about, the mid-80s. Absolutely in the minds of I think most people here today. And he talks there of the feelings of illegitimacy, and of the feelings in large parts of Australian society that Labor is illegitimate. And he says this was a massive force behind tearing down Whitlam and various other Labor difficulties. And you can see that after that. You can see that, 20, 30 years later in what happened in the Rudd-Gillard years. There was a concerted campaign by the Murdoch press in particular to paint, in particular, Julia Gillard's minority government as illegitimate. But I think there was generally a sense of Labor just not quite having earned the right to power. And you could feel that, working in that government, you could feel that the Liberals felt that they had been unfairly robbed of power, not just in that minority government, but before that. And they were just waiting for their turn to come by again. And when that government tore itself apart, understandably, I think that awakened those feelings within a lot of Labor MPs. And those Labor ministers from that time still dominate the Albanese cabinet. So naturally enough, they carry those scars. And, I think when we're talking about the structures that fuel politics, we have to always remember that politics is made up of a bunch of men and women, and that they are emotional beings. And all of those people, I think, are walking around carrying those emotions. And that means those feelings of shame and illegitimacy and the desire to transcend them. And I think that means they've tried to learn two particular things, and I think both are causing real problems for the ambition of this government. One is they've looked at the battles that the Rudd and Gillard government fought with business over, particularly over the carbon price and the mining tax. And it's important to remember just how ferociously big business went at those governments. And I think this government has learnt from that, to some extent understandably, that they need to be cautious. in their dealings with business. My feeling is they've overlearned that, that they really shy away from battles. They're often, as I said before, they often try to do things that kind of go under the radar. They announced a tax on gas companies in their first term. It was so low that on the day it was announced, the share prices in those companies rose. And that is, I think that is fairly emblematic. You can see it in the gambling reforms I was just talking about, in a whole number of areas, not least climate change. Big business, I think, has the government running scared in a kind of long-term sense. So that's one lesson I think they've overlearned. Not completely incorrect to learn it, but I think have just taken it on a bit too much. The second one I think they've got wrong entirely, which is that they are terrified of the disunity of the Rudd-Gillard years. And, fair enough, obviously there was a lot of disunity, obviously that brought the government down in the end. But it wasn't where the problem started. The problem started with a hugely electorally popular Prime Minister who dominated his caucus and cabinet, and with a caucus and cabinet who were afraid to stand up to him and say, hey, we've got some problems here or some things we disagree with, and those problems built and bubbled away until they exploded. And I don't think the same thing's going to happen to Anthony Albanese. I think he's much, he's very skilled at managing the caucus, but you need a valve, and you need a way for people to warn a leader of the things that they don't and can't see. So I think Labor has absolutely learnt the wrong lesson there, and that brings us back to that quiet caucus issue. And you can see, as I say that, learning the lessons from the Rudd-Gillard years at the same time as that balance tilts from idealism to pragmatism, a bunch of structural factors are coming together to lead the government to its current set of behaviours.
Yeah. It's interesting because actually you talk in the essay somewhat counterintuitively about the risk of not having ideals, about the need for the ideals to then discipline your behaviour. You talk about the function of a promise and the way a promise binds you to behave in a certain way. And you use the example I was very interested in of Bob Hawke's famous promise that no child would live in poverty by 1990, for which he was widely criticised. Can you explain why you think that was a useful thing for him to do as a Prime Minister?
Yeah, Graham Freudenberg, the great Labor speechwriter, has written about this, and he wrote the line, so he's quite heavily invested. Bob Hawke came out later, after his prime ministership, I think, and said he regretted that line. And Freudenberg was understandably upset at this, and he doesn't regret the line, and he doesn't regret it for two reasons, both of which I think are really important and valid. The first is that line was backed up by policy action, and that policy action, in the form of a new payment, reduced child poverty by 30%, which is huge, a huge achievement, I think. And I think that points to the fact that Prime Ministers, all of us, I think, can be brave with our words. And sometimes, when we are brave with our words, it makes us braver with our actions. We give ourselves an ideal to live up to. And in some sense, that is the value of election promises, or of big election promises. And it is the downside of, I think, the current environment where politicians are quite scared of making promises, because it just tamps down ambition. And it is true. It is absolutely true that you can make a big promise and you'd be embarrassed, and Bob Hawke was embarrassed, but it can also impel action. And then the second thing is, it's a political benefit. Freudenberg says, what is forgotten now is the immense aura of excitement in that event, which was in the Sydney Opera House. It was the launch of the 87 election campaign, I think. And he said the room was just electrified. And Labor went on to win that election, and he thinks that was a part of it. And I'm sure he's right. And the reason I'm sure he's right is because I think excitement is a really big factor in politics. And I would go further and I would say excitement has always been a big factor, particularly in Labor politics. A long time ago, when I was working in politics, a Labor elder said to me, the mob expects something more from Labor. And the phrase has always stuck in my mind. And I think it has two meanings. I think it is a political expectation. They want that excitement from Labor. It makes sense, I think, that the two major political parties in Australia offer people different things, and those different things exist at different substantive levels. They exist in different ideologies, but they also exist in different emotional registers. It is standardly the Liberal Party has offered management and calmness, and the Labor Party has offered some level of excitement, and that arguably has been a weakness and at times politically, and that's what Anthony Albanese recognises, but it's also been a source of immense strength. Anyway, that politics side is one side, but then I think he also means substantively in terms of changing the country. There is this ability of politics, I think, to transcend the here and now, to remind us that something better is possible, to remind us that the world we live in is not the only world possible. And more often, it has been the left-wing parties that have offered that, I think. And I think people do want that on some level from Labor parties. And it is possible I'm wrong. I should say, there's a big thing I write in this essay. It's possible I'm wrong when I put these ideas out there. It is possible that we live in a new time, and Anthony Albanese, in wanting Labor to be the natural party of government, has discovered something, which is that people want calmness more than anything right now. And I think that absolutely was true at the last election, when there was a huge reaction against the chaos of Trump world. I don't know if that's a permanent change in the landscape. I don't know if Anthony Albanese will act like that permanently.
So let's hold your feet to the fire. You're advising Anthony Albanese, and he comes to you with his version of no child will live in poverty, this type of statement. Would you advise him to embrace something like that, even though the probability is that he is going to fail to meet that standard, and that the way the media ecosystem works now, he will be roundly criticised from all quarters and will pay a huge political price? Would you say he should still do that because it's important for the government to have a direction and to have a vision and to have an ideal?
So it's a great question, Misha. It's a great question. And part of the reason it's a great question is because when you are inside government, you do tend to act differently. As you indicated before, you start to prioritise survival. You start to live in the day-to-day and manage the million and one things. And in that environment, I was a press secretary. Your job is partly risk aversion, right, or risk management. So I can absolutely imagine myself in that situation saying, "Don't do that. That's daft." And I think I would be wrong. I really do think that politicians need to offer some versions of those things at times. Now, they need to be choosy. And one argument you can make, by the way, to tear down my argument is Anthony Albanese did do a version of that in the first term. He said, we're going to try to get the voice done.
Yeah.
And I think that was actually a really courageous thing. And I think that is something criticisms of the government tend to skim over. I do think that was a really bold thing. So I think a question for the government, a really interesting question, I absolutely don't know the answer, is whether that scared them off doing anything, making bold commitments like that again, or whether they recognise that was a particular set of circumstances and you just do not win referendums if you don't have bipartisan support in this country.
I think the other problem is that potentially the commitment, which, I don't doubt the genuineness of it, to pursue the voice starts to look shallower as time passes on, as the government doesn't do anything else in that space. If you're genuinely committed to it, you don't just try once and go, that didn't work, and then run off. Surely there must be some sort of follow-through in terms of that sort of policy commitment.
Look, I think that's absolutely right. One of the things I write towards the end of the essay is about failure in the Labor Party, and I think it ties back to this illegitimacy question. I think the Labor Party, at this point in time, worries too much about its failures. It tends to fixate on what it sees as its political mistakes. And you could see this in the celebration of the commemorations of Whitlam's dismissal. there was a lot of talk in the political class in general about Whitlam's achievements, but also an immense focus on his mistakes. And you can see this in a speech that Anthony Albanese made about the dismissal, and he talked about, or about Whitlam, and he talked about Whitlam's achievements, but then he talked about lessons to be learned, and they were lessons about what not to do. And this really struck me, because it seems to me at this point in our history, looking back at the Whitlam government, which has probably the largest legacy of any government since, the main question we should be asking is what to do. You know, how can a government do as much as that government? Not what mistakes can be avoided so they could govern a little bit longer. Noel Pearson gave this tribute after Whitlam died, and he said, you know, we should not regret, he said it in better words than me, but we should not regret 3 years. You know, was 3 years not enough time? And obviously it was enough time to get a huge amount done. So I feel like I've drifted from the question a little bit.
So let me bring you back to, I guess, the whole core of the essay, which really is you're asking about belief in the government and what this government actually believes. Did you get to a point where you've got a sense of what it believes? Like, what does the Albanese government believe?
One of the most hardening things, I think, that Anthony Albanese has done as Prime Minister, and I don't think this is a matter of being on one side or the other, I just think it's a really interesting, strong intervention for a Prime Minister to make, is his talk about kindness. He said during the election campaign that kindness is not weakness, and he said on election night that kindness is an Australian value, and that facing global challenges, one of the Australian ways of doing that was looking after each other. And I think that's a really strong statement to make, a really interesting statement to make. I think it's a very personal statement for Anthony Albanese. And I do think the government believes, I think Anthony Albanese believes in looking after those who need more help.
And yet here again you run into this gap between your beliefs and your actions, because kindness is all very well to talk about.
Yes.
But you cite, for example, the increase to the rate of job seeker. I forget exactly when in the cycle that happened, I think in the first term. And say basically within a year, you know, it was back to where it was, and there were no sort of attempts to then continue to do that piece of work. Well, so again, exactly. Like The Voice, you've got this little, I'm going to dip my toe into policy area. Oh, well, that didn't work, or that's done now. I'm going to drift off to somewhere else. Like, where is the commitment?
Well, no, exactly. So I think rhetoric can be very important, right? John Howard uses the phrase, he says comfortable and relaxed, it gets turned into relaxed and comfortable, and then he keeps using that phrase. And I think that had a dramatic impact on Australia, because I think if you are Prime Minister for a long time, as Anthony Albanese wants to be, and you reflect a version of Australians back to ourselves, then you can bring us closer to that reality. And I think John Howard achieved that. And that's why I say I think talking about kindness is important. But of course you're right, it needs to be matched by something else. And to come back to the point about failure, which I veered away from, I think one of the difficulties with Labor is that they've become scared of revisiting anything that hasn't seemed to work in the past. So, for example, Bill Shorten deals with negative gearing and capital gains tax. Significant measures when you're talking about equality and redressing the gap between those who have assets and those who don't. But Labor seems terrified of touching that again. And it's true in other areas as well. It's true, say, of carbon pricing. A point I make in the essay is that we forget now, or Labor seems to forget, that Bill Shorten was in opposition, and it's always very, very difficult to announce huge reforms from opposition, as John Hewson famously discovered. It is, we have to remember that Julia Gillard was the first female Prime Minister facing huge misogynistic attacks, with Kevin Rudd behind her, a divided caucus, in minority government. Anthony Albanese doesn't face any of those challenges. So when it comes to measures to actually back up the kindness, as you say, for example, increasing job seeker, I do feel that the government needs to, put some, what's the phrase, put some skin on the bones.
Meat on the bone or something.
And one of the things I try to, well, there are two things I bear in mind. One is inflation was a huge factor in the first term. And when people like myself are critiquing the government and saying, well, that there's an element of timidity, and there is. It is important to remember that inflation, I think, made it very difficult to talk about some things. It would have been a hard time to really talk about larger scale tax reform. And the difficulty with government is you're always facing those things. And, we've just discovered that we may again be in a rising inflationary environment. And so governments are always in these spots. There's always an excuse not to act. There's always a good reason, political reason not to act. But as somebody said to me the other day, and I think they were perhaps accidentally quoting Anthony Albanese, he was quoting other people from history, if not now, when, is the question that the governments ultimately have to ask themselves, because that is actually what you are facing every single day.
So let's go back to that sort of if not now, when question, because I think it's really interesting. You very early in the essay, you quote Ross Gittins and Greg Sheridan, two notable journalists, talking about the shallowness of political discussion during this year's campaign, basically saying that it was incredibly trivial. There were very, very few points of policy difference between Labor and the opposition. And I think Gittins said it was, in 50 years of covering politics, it was one of the worst elections he'd ever seen, or the worst election he'd ever seen. My question is, what causes that? Is that the fault of the politicians? Is this failure of idealism a failure of nerve, a failure of character, a failure of imagination? Or is it actually a failure of our political system itself? Is it just not possible to prosecute those arguments anymore? Would you be foolhardy to do so? I mean, I presume there are tactical reasons why there were very few real meaningful policy differences between the Coalition and Labor at the last election.
Yeah.
Has something changed?
I mean, lots of things have changed.
Yeah.
Some of the structural shifts that I talked about in relation to Labor are important. Obviously, the Liberal Party is also torn in an ideological sense, so that has made it very difficult for the Liberal Party to have a strong, coherent policy agenda over the last few electoral cycles, because constantly the leader is having to come up with policy that somehow satisfies both the moderates and the extreme right of the party, and really that means kind of dodging things and cobbling stuff together that ends up being fairly meaningless. For example, the nuclear policy, which everybody knew was a fudge to avoid having to actually talk about net zero. And so there are structural factors and divides in the parties. You also have the question of the media, of course. And this is definitely something people in politics believe, and they're not entirely wrong, right? Definitely the media landscape has changed. It is incredibly fragmented. It's very hard to reach large chunks of people at all, including large chunks of young people who simply avoid the mainstream press. All of those things mean that it may be, I think it probably is, much more difficult to conduct a serious policy conversation. We were talking about this earlier today, a serious policy conversation with the Australian public. And I wonder sometimes if we have overdone this narrative, if the political class has kind of accepted somewhere along the way that reform is harder. And the reason they've accepted that is because, why? Because the Labor Party went crazy and tore down its leader rather than delivering a carbon pollution reduction scheme. So we don't really know. We don't really know what would have happened at the next election if Rudd had persisted with his mining tax and his carbon price? Or are we basing on the fact that Julia Gillard, facing the worst set of political circumstances of any recent Prime Minister, couldn't deliver a carbon price? It seems to me that we don't really know, because at the start of that cycle there were terrible circumstances or very weird circumstances, and in the last 10 years people have just stopped attempting things to a very large extent, with the obvious exception of Bill Shorten, again, doing things from opposition, not a good example. So it feels to me that it hasn't been tested. We haven't had a strong reforming government facing into this media landscape. I think that gives me hope. Before the last election, the Labor Party did figure out a way in which the media landscape has shifted. They figured out that you actually need a lot of time for an argument to trickle through to people. And so rather than announcing big policies during the election campaign, which is traditionally what has happened. You have a 5 or 6 week map and you announce big policies, you know exactly when you're going to do them, you follow them up with campaign materials. Instead of doing that, they made a series of Medicare announcements. They did them early in the year, well before the actual election campaign, and they did that because they knew the landscape was so fragmented and it would have time to get to people, and it did. And that makes me wonder if, well, what if they tried the same approach with a difficult reform? You know, Medicare, making Medicare better is a pretty easy sellable reform. You're not trying to win an argument, you're just trying to make people aware of what you're doing. You know, and that's just a question we don't know the answer to. Could they win an argument in those circumstances?
Yeah, interesting. In the essay, you talk a lot about Anthony Albanese and his language. For example, he's talking about his priorities. There's one point where you quote him and he says, "I want to talk about these things." And you're like, why is your priority talking about them rather than doing something on them? But it's interesting, compared to your book about Scott Morrison, which was a very sharp critique of Morrison's sort of way of seeing politics. It was called The Game for a reason. You know, he was very sort of Machiavellian in the way that he negotiated political challenges and marketed himself as a political figure, and you unpick that in the book. And you basically make an argument in that book that Scott Morrison's sort of core political belief underneath that was reasonably opaque. He was really in that space of playing the political game to win. It seems to me that you do in this essay come to a slightly different conclusion about Anthony Albanese. You do feel that he has political beliefs, but you do seem to find them very hard to discern, and you do seem to be arguing that they are somewhat lightly held. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you think about his core beliefs and how they drive him in terms of what we might see from Albanese, you know, down the track for the remainder of this term and perhaps in another term?
Okay, in both of the books, and sometimes you only realise this, you know, much later. I think I've only just begun to realise this with the Morrison book in a way. I think they're really both trying to get at structural shifts in our politics. The Morrison book, because his beliefs are opaque in a way, are less about Scott Morrison and the man and more about the fact that Morrison was the peak of a certain set of developments in the style in which politics was practiced, you know, a certain performativity.
Daggy Dad barbecues.
Rugby
club that he loved.
You know, in which he kind of created a character for us,
yeah.
And the media were prepared to buy into that at the expense of any in-depth policy discussion, at the expense of any analysis of what he has actually done in his public life. We get attracted to the image, and that, you know, that ties to developments in our media culture, of our kind of narcissistic image-obsessed culture. And in this essay, it's more, I suppose, about the Labor Party and the way that the Labor Party has shifted over time, and to some extent political parties, because you also have, and this ties back to the question of belief, you have the fact that people don't subscribe to beliefs as easily, as simply as they once did. You know, we go back a few decades and people would say, as an identity, you know, I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant, I'm Labor, I'm Liberal, I'm a member of Rotary or the Lions, and all of those types of things began to break down, which meant the political parties suddenly had to target people in very different ways, which then meant political parties were trying to satisfy a really broad range of people, which meant they either played to the lowest common denominator or targeted people with a bunch of completely unconnected policies, targeting this group, then that group, and this group. So that's, you know, I think in a way neither of them exactly is about the man. I think one of the interesting things, if you look at belief, one of the most interesting policy interventions the government has made is the social media ban. And the reason I think it's really interesting is because I think it is fundamentally expressing a view of how life should be lived. So it's not what a lot of the government's interventions have been, which is we're going to throw a little bit of money at university students. We're not going to restructure fees. We're not going to reform universities anyway. We're just going to give students a bit more cash, ex-students. A lot of them are kind of that little splashes of money type style. Very small scale interventions don't deal with the fundamental problems. But here they are going, actually, we're going to make a society-wide intervention, and it is about the way people live their lives. It is about children, but it is also about all of us. It is about the role of phones in our lives. It is about the role of social media in our lives. It is about how families interact, which comes back to a moral vision of the world. And the reason, that is enough to make that interesting to me. But the additional reason I think that's interesting is because the moment we find ourselves at as a society is a really interesting one, in that we are part of the neoliberal society. The neoliberal society is a society of markets and deregulation and privatisation, in which everything is private and everything is subject to the market, aged care, childcare, our entire lives basically. And that has been the consensus since Reagan and Thatcher. And you can see this in the culture in general. The debate is slowly moving away from it. Not entirely, but there is more and more dissatisfaction with the way we live our lives, and I think in particular with the level of inequality in our society. And while that measure doesn't deal with inequality, and one of my strongest criticisms of the government is that they are failing in a very large way to deal with inequality, that to me signals the potential start of a genuine questioning of the way we live. Whereas I think a lot of what the government does is at the opposite end of the spectrum. It is actually about leaving things as they are. And I talk in the book about the way this government has kind of moved into a conservative approach to Australia. And that means accepting society as it is. So I wonder if there's a little hint in that social media stuff.
It's interesting. It seems one of the arguments you're making is that a sort of a political pragmatism or managerialism inevitably drifts towards a conservatism. It ends up being that you are thinking about preserving a certain way of the world being. And you talk about, for example, Anthony Albanese, when he's asked about his beliefs, and he talks about, I like fighting Tories, or I like doing these certain things. But it seems that those are almost about preserving a way of the world being, not a vision of the world being a different way. And I think what you're saying, and I think this is interesting, and this is right, that with the social media ban, you're starting to see some sort of sense of an idea about what it might mean to be in a society, and the government prepared to actually take a risk. I mean, in some ways it's a low political risk. You're not, taking money off anybody. It's the downside risk is lower than perhaps some other policies, but it still is a risk. It's the sort of thing where there could be a lot of criticism of that policy. A lot of young people are unhappy about it, but it is sort of expressing something that feels close to a value. So it does feel like it could chart something else. Let me go back to another question though. Early in the essay, you talk about your own beliefs and being put on the spot and not being able to articulate your own beliefs. I'm really interested, since you've written it now, you're out, you're talking about the book, have you got to a stronger sense of your own beliefs? Can you articulate them now? Like, what are your core political beliefs? I'm serious. I'm really interested.
It's a great question. I'm absolutely not going to answer it. Part of the reason is that, I have not given it a lot more thought since that question. I think in part because I instead, maybe as a kind of denial obfuscation mechanism, switched paths to thinking about what this government believes. Maybe this is just a long, long way of avoiding dealing with what I believe. And I guess it comes back to that role question in a way. In a sense, I guess it has made me think about what my role is as I try to write things, as I try to write columns, or as I try to write the essay. And I think it is to, this is a cliche, but I think it is to be as honest as possible with people about what I think is happening, not trying to pull any punches. I think that is a really important role if you are going to take on, the job of speaking about things publicly. And because obviously some of my political values come through, I guess there is that I guess I do, at this point, have a fundamental concern with the inequality that is growing up in our society. And I have real reservations about the type of society that has developed over the last 30 or 40 years.
It would seem to me also without wanting to put words into your mouth, that one of the core beliefs that you really show through this essay is a belief that we should hold our political leaders to a higher standard, that we shouldn't necessarily accept the contemporary way of doing things, and that there should be a discussion not about how things are working now, but what is possible in a more imaginative way. Do you think that there are other people who are doing this well, and who are they? Are there other people who our politicians should be looking to, interesting thinkers, interesting ideas?
No, I don't have a list of that. I'm sorry. I wish I did. The Marxist writer Perry Anderson talks about economic periods in history, big economic shifts, neoliberalism being one of them, and talks about what happens in those periods. And he says often what happens is I haven't looked at what he wrote for a while, so I may get this a little bit wrong, but fundamentally he says there are big material shifts. There is sometimes a material crisis in society, and that causes a new set of politicians to become elected, like Margaret Thatcher. And then the other factor is somewhere off on the fringes of society, a set of ideas have been developed. And those ideas suddenly are able to be dragged to centre stage by a new generation of politicians, and that combination then sees those ideas spread throughout society. And I think this is a really big question, and I do not have the answer. Is there a new set of ideas being generated somewhere on the fringes of society right now about what comes after the kind of extreme, fairly extreme neoliberal consensus that we've lived through for the last few decades? Because it's definitely true that governments, and certainly I think governments of left and right are both moving away from it in certain ways. I think this is a really interesting development. I think the right is moving away from it faster than the left, actually. I think it's one reason the right is having success with people like Donald Trump, because they're actually prepared to really be very strongly critical of the way economies have developed and the inequality that has grown up, and they've given voice to the immense dissatisfaction that's felt by many people in the working classes, or many people who have lost out in that battle for assets. The left, a lot of people have made this observation, and it is absolutely true. The right moving to attack the institutions in particular has left the left in the position of defending those institutions, which then has left the left in the position of essentially defending society as it is right now. And that brings us right back to the conservative point.
Yeah. So now we've got in a way, a conservative left government. That sort of is a.
I think this is why I say maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe Labor doesn't need to offer more than maybe people don't expect it to do anything more. Maybe there is a world in which people expect Labor governments to be managerial. Maybe that's where we're heading. And the right tears up the joint, and the left tries to preserve.
They're the party of government. That'd be
exactly, and be the natural party of government, which has traditionally been the title of the Liberal Party. It's tremendously interesting to me that Anthony Albanese wants that, and he's not the first Labor leader to want that, but it's nonetheless an interesting shift to try to manage.
Okay, we're drawing towards the end. I've just got a few questions from the audience that I do want to try to get in the last 5 minutes we have available. So actually, just on that point about the conservatism, somebody in the audience submitted this question. Is Anthony Albanese, like John Howard in Labor form, relaxed and comfortable?
A few people have made this comparison to me. I think it's a really good comparison. I think Anthony Albanese absolutely learnt a lot from John Howard. I think in terms of Labor leaders, a really interesting thing has happened, which is often they've combined two qualities. Whitlam had crash and crash through. But he also had retail politics. He had this knowledge of getting sewerage in the western suburbs of Sydney and into Brisbane, and he had big vision. Whitlam. So then you have Hawke and Keating. Hawke is that consensus prime minister that Anthony Albanese wants to be, but he also had Keating, this kind of conflict-driven guy. And so Anthony Albanese could well play that role, but he needs some other force around him, balancing that. I think this is you need that duality in politics. I'm not sure you need, historically, I'm not sure you've needed on the Liberal side in the same way, but I think in Labor you've always needed those two poles.
Okay. So another question which is perhaps tangentially related. Are factions divided by ideology still, or is it better to think of them as being divided more like different mafia families?
Definitely different mafia families. And, Anthony Albanese, in very different language, has said as much. He said quite recently, as a really, as a good thing, that the factions don't really wear ideological hats anymore.
He's brought the families together.
That's right. That's right.
Interesting. Okay. Why is the Labor government reducing the transparency of its decisions? Somebody has asked. I guess this has got to do with things like FOI, law changes, failures to do things on whistleblowers, like a general sort of that whole transparency agenda, which the Anti-Corruption Commission, I guess, was part of, again, feels like it's sort of stalled, and that agenda of sort of government transparency too. Yeah,
look, its record is mixed, to be fair. It did some things around whistleblowers and some things it didn't do in that first term. I think that the answer is that this is the natural tendency for anyone in power. And this is always the difficulty. This is why you always need people restraining people with power, or you need people reminding them or pushing them to do something else. And that's not just Anthony Albanese. That's the way power goes. The nature of power is to protect itself.
Okay. One last question, and we're going to have to wrap up. But in asking this question, I sort of want to unpick it a little bit. The question is, how healthy do you think democracy is in Australia?
How
healthy do you think democracy is in Australia? And just to give that a bit of context, I think it's a really good question, because it seems to me that in the past few years anyway, politicians and also journalists have started to talk a lot more about Australian democracy, distinguishing it from American democracy, talking about the strengths of compulsory voting and the Australian Electoral Commission, proportional representation, the way our political system works, trying to say that we have something here that is unique and special and precious. The cynical part of me, though, when I hear politicians saying it, I always think, well, that's an easy thing to say, because again, it's an inherently conservative thing to say. Our system is fine, don't you worry. So I wonder, what do you think? How healthy is our democracy, and what do you think are the risks it's facing now?
Look, right now it's very healthy, but a friend, very experienced political guy said to me recently, like, the moment in life, any of life, you start to think you're the special one, and things will work differently for you, like, that's the moment you should realise you're deluding yourself. So it is possible, but to be honest, I don't think the threats to democracy in other parts of the world right now. Let's turn it around. Let's not ask why Australia is doing well. Do we think the threats to democracy in those other countries is because they don't have an AEC and because they don't have compulsory voting? Or do we think it's because their political system has failed large numbers of people and allowed a chasm of inequality to open up, and the governments have failed to deliver the services that people expect? Now, I tend to think it's the latter. Those structural parts of our system, I think, are wonderful, and they are really important, and we should defend them. And it is possible that they are keeping us safe. They're certainly playing a role in it. But very quickly, I wrote in the essay, an American philosopher, Richard Rorty, 27 years ago, said, if the Democratic Party continues like it does now, staying in the sterile centre, avoiding all talk of redistributive politics, then soon enough we will have a strongman, an overclass running this country, the super rich running the economy, jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion, is his phrase, and racial slurs will spread. And that is exactly what has happened. And the Labor frontbencher Andrew Leigh has said we are a generation away from American-style inequality in this country on current trends. So, I don't want to test that out in a generation. I don't want to test out whether compulsory voting is the one thing that's keeping us safe.
Okay.
I think we need to do more about inequality.
Thank you, Sean. I wanted to say thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you, Sean. It is an absolutely terrific essay. It's incredibly rigorous and thoughtful and nuanced. It's exactly the sort of political writing we need in Australia, and I think it's a conversation really worth having, although I started off by saying that I think Sean was somewhat brave to write it, because I think if you're politically cynical, you can sort of dismiss some of the aspirations about ideals. I think it's a very important part of political discourse. So it's great that you're all here talking about it. It's terrific that so many of you have read it already, and I would encourage you, if you haven't, grab a copy when it's over. But thank you very much for coming tonight.